As a 31-year-old stay-at-home mom with two young children, I prefer spending time alone, whether it's shopping, driving, or running errands. I got to my usual target around 8:30 p.m. Be cautious when going out alone in public, especially at night. I always carry a key button, an alarm, and a universal handcuff key with me. Just in case, I parked just in front of the business, next to a cart caddy, and took mental notes on the other vehicles parking around. As a precaution, I was trained at a young age to always be aware of my surroundings, which is something that comes naturally to control freaks. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night, and the parking lot was rather empty, most likely due to the fact that it was a weekday. As I walked into the store, I started browsing as usual, following the natural flow of the departments. I had barely been wandering the main aisle for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes when I observed a young man, tall and slender, dressed in a dirty gray two-piece sweatsuit and brown work boots. He looked over at me. I smiled and said hello, but his face remained blank. The look in his eyes suggested that he was high, yet he didn't seem to notice my greeting. Gestured and swiftly walked on. At first sight, there was nothing particularly scary about him, save for the fact that he was meandering along the main aisle with no cart or basket, hands in his pockets, and no apparent companion. I continued shopping without hesitation and made my way to the next department. After a few minutes, I observed another young man wearing the same gray sweatshirt and work boots. He didn't have any carts or baskets. He cast a glance at me, then hastily averted his gaze when he noticed I was gazing directly at him. I got slightly more awake, but I stayed composed and continued browsing. After about 15 minutes, a third older man grabbed my eye, dressed in the same gray sweatsuit and work boots, with no cart or basket, just his hands in his pockets. I figured they were in some kind of work uniform, possibly construction workers, but I couldn't figure out why they weren't going about together, and why they didn't have anything to buy at this time. It was difficult to concentrate on browsing since I had a horrible feeling about these three men, and something seemed odd. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I felt as if the three of them were keeping track of my whereabouts and conversing about it. It didn't take long for one of the three males to pass by whatever side aisle I was in, alerting me to their presence. I remained attentive, trying not to panic or let my suspicions overwhelm me. Something about their presence felt heavy and dark, so I wanted to test their intents to ensure I wasn't overthinking things and that my awful gut feeling was correct. I started picking random aisles and going back and forth between departments in a disorganized and unpredictable manner to see if the males would keep passing by me as frequently as they had been. Just a few minutes after I entered each aisle, one of them would materialize, looking me down as they passed. It felt as if I was being pursued like a wild animal. Even though they were no longer attempting to blend in, which was the worst part of it all, and everything primal was screaming at me to get out of there. I grabbed my cart hard, thinking that if they got too close, I could use it to push them away or create some space. By this point, I had been shopping for maybe an hour, maybe a little more, and was ready to buy my purchases. Honestly, I was too uncomfortable to continue browsing, even if I wanted to. The men had been following me for quite some time, and I was growing increasingly annoyed. The store was quite empty at the time, which is one of the reasons I prefer to shop at night. But this situation was even more unnerving. Two preteen girls were roaming about by themselves, which piqued my interest because the men had bypassed them and made similar advances. The girls were clueless, so I discreetly drew their attention and instructed them to go locate their parents and stay with them, trying not to terrify them out. The mother and I were in full protection mode. I couldn't have imagined having my little children with me on this night. Thank God they arrived home safely. As I made my way to the checkout, I observed one of the males approaching from behind, walking faster. As he approached, I immediately paused and turned to meet his gaze. I'll never forget the darkness in his eyes. An unsettling sneer developed on his face as he prodded my shoulder, continuing to stare me down and stepping backward to maintain his deadly glare as he exited the shop. I had lost sight of the other two men, and I despised the ambiguity of the situation. He delivered his warning emphatically. My stomach plummeted, and my entire body shook. It was a feeling I hadn't had since I was a child and got lost in the store. In a state of urgency, I rushed to the checkout and discreetly asked the cashier if I could talk with a manager, telling them what had happened during the last hour. When I told the management what had transpired, I respectfully requested that a male employee take me to my car and notify a member of their security team. Her expression lowered, as if she had already known about these men. Once I described them, she affirmed she knew who I was talking about. She explained that several female employees had found the males unpleasant in the past and promised me that someone would accompany me to my car. She filed a report about the incident and stated she would notify the authorities. I was still shaking, but I was happy that she believed me and expressed concern about the other young female customers in the store. She took my details, and a young male employee led me outside to my car. What I saw as I exited the store made me sick to my stomach and confirmed all of my worries. A white windowless van was parked just behind my car, about 3 parking spots away. One of the males sat in the driver's seat, while the other 2 leaned against the side of the van facing my car, trying to hide from view. I mean, how cliché and obvious can you get? At that point, your license plate might as well read Lady Snatchers. Whatever their intention, it did not appear pure. I pointed them out to the male employee and stated, "There they are." This led the men to rush into the van and drive out of the parking lot without hesitation. I honestly don't know what would have happened if I had walked out to my car alone, and I'm so thankful I made it home safely to tell my tale. Over the next week, I learned that there were several abduction attempts at the shopping area adjacent to Target, and I'm very confident they were the same music individuals from the early 2000s. In December 2001, my family was in Europe, and we were returning to Latin America for the Christmas holiday. My brother and I, both in high school at the time, and my father were flying from Paris to Miami. My father was in business class, and my brother and I were in coach, taking up the middle 2 seats in the middle row. The flight began normally, with nothing unusual about it. About 4 or 5 hours into the journey, I was reading a book and about to fall asleep when I heard a woman repeatedly say the word no. It started out low, nearly inaudible, but quickly became loud and urgent. Before I knew what was going on, she was shouting, "No, no, no," at the top of her lungs. I looked up and saw a flight attendant a few rows ahead of me to the right hunched over someone in the window seat. My first thought was that a passenger was having a heart attack or some catastrophic health issue, but her yelling was so unsettling that this didn't seem right. There was a strangely long delay in people's reactions. Nobody did anything. I completely panicked and froze in my seat. My brother, on the other hand, jumped out of his seat, leaped over the person sitting in the aisle seat to his right, and ran up to see what was going on. He was up there in a matter of seconds, and as he approached, suddenly everyone around us stood up to see what was happening or to try to help. The woman kept screaming, and now she was struggling with the passenger. He was really tall, so tall that his entire head was visible over the back of the seat. He had long, curly black hair. My brother came back to our row and said something is wrong before going back up to get a closer look. Passengers close to the woman began struggling with the man as well. A bunch of people jumped on him and started pulling at him. Someone in the row behind him even pulled his hair back so hard that his face jerked toward the top of the plane. He let out a loud moan or scream, and then chaos broke loose. The aisles were so crowded that nobody could move, and I saw a fire extinguisher being passed hand to hand from the back of the plane. I immediately thought there was a fire and that we were all going to die. It was an incredibly hopeless feeling knowing there was nowhere to run and no way to escape the unfolding situation. The extinguisher was passed to a male flight attendant near the man, and he hit him with the butt of it really hard in the face. Then they started asking for belts, headphone straps, or anything they could use to restrain him. My brother took off his belt and gave it to them, and they used it along with other items to wrap around the man's arms, shoulders, and torso, securing him to the seat. I saw the male flight attendant, who had hit the man with the extinguisher, carry a pair of large black tennis shoes to the back of the plane. At the time it seemed strange, but I didn't think much of it. The flight attendants asked if there was a doctor on board who could sedate the man. People also kept asking if there was an air marshal on board, but nobody came forward. Eventually, things calmed down. Everyone was told to return to their seats. A small group of people who had helped restrain the man was asked to keep guard on a rotation. There were always at least a few people sitting behind or next to him, keeping an eye on him. I think there was even someone behind him holding a fistful of his hair. For the rest of the flight, the pilot announced over the PA system that there had been a security breach. He didn't say much more, but he advised us to get to know our neighbor, implying they didn't know if the man was acting alone. We were in the middle of the Atlantic with maybe 4 more hours before we could land. The mood was ominous and tense, but most passengers were surprisingly friendly and in good spirits despite the circumstances. Nobody fully knew what had happened. We weren't allowed to get up from our seats, and if you had to use the bathroom, you needed to call a flight attendant to escort you there. You weren't allowed to lock the door. A grumpy old French man a few rows from us kept ignoring the rules, getting up without permission just to annoy the flight attendants. They were not amused. Eventually, they put on the movie Legally Blonde to distract the passengers. My brother and I went up to business class to talk to my dad. Apparently, the people in business class hadn't heard the extent of the chaos in coach, and they were going about business as usual. A few hours later, as we approached the U.S., we saw fighter jets outside the windows on both sides of the plane. The pilot announced they were escorting us to Boston Logan Airport. A few kids got really excited watching the jets. I later learned these jets were a last resort security measure to prevent hijacked planes from repeating 9/11-style attacks. They were prepared to shoot us down if necessary. We landed and were told to stay seated. A SWAT team boarded the plane carrying assault rifles and tons of body armor. They cut off all the man's restraints and took him off the plane. I saw everything in detail as we were seated only a few rows behind him. Afterward, we were parked on the tarmac for hours before being allowed to disembark. We were taken to a baggage claim area at Logan Airport and kept there for what felt like 3 or 4 hours. Nobody explained anything to us. Passengers grew agitated, shaking the metal fences and yelling at the airport personnel about the inhumane treatment of children were crying, and people were trying to sleep on the baggage carousel. Finally, they ordered pizzas and led us into a waiting area with chairs. Each passenger was interrogated by the FBI. The agents were unfriendly, clearly trying to determine if the man had an accomplice on board. Afterward, security officers' hands searched every passenger's shoes, luggage, and carry-ons. Everyone was patted down. We were finally allowed to make phone calls. When we called my mom, we learned for the first time what had happened was that an Islamic extremist had tried to blow up the plane with a bomb hidden in his shoe. Up until this point, my dad, brother, and I had remained relatively calm. We had no idea how serious the security breach really was or how close we had come to being killed. After about 12 hours in Boston, we were put on another flight home. My brother made the mistake of giving interviews to CNN and other networks, so when we landed in our home country, he was swarmed by the press and gave even more interviews despite being exhausted. We later learned the bomber, Richard Reed, had tried to board the same flight the day before, but missed it due to red flags raised by French security. He was put on the next day's flight. The rain that day had wet his shoes, which likely prevented him from successfully igniting the bomb's wick. Reed is now serving 3 life terms in prison. My dad frequently travels for his job and has accumulated a lot of miles through Delta. Both he and my mom bought me a ticket with miles as an early Christmas present from Oregon to Montana, so I could spend time with my boyfriend during his finals week, since my finals were finished a week before his. Luckily, we drove back to Oregon together for his winter break, so I didn't have to deal with the hassle of flying back. This was my first flight completely alone, and the only occasion I will fly out to see my boyfriend because he always drives back home during his school breaks. I had a 2-hour layover in Salt Lake City before I would fly out to Montana. During that time, I kept myself occupied by sitting alone somewhat close to where my gate was charging my phone and browsing Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. I was sitting at a table up against the wall where you could look out the window and see the airplanes that were parked or getting ready to taxi. There were tables lined up all along this wall, mostly filled with 1 or 2 people, and there were large decorative plants between every couple of tables. As I was sitting there, this man approached me, probably in his mid-20s. He wasn't very tall, had a long dark coat on, and carried only a backpack, and there was something very off about his demeanor I didn't notice until I looked him in the eyes and saw that they were not aligned. Knowing how people can't help how they look, I was friendly when he said hello and introduced himself. He held out two of his fingers so I could shake them, which was already odd. He sat down on one of the chairs facing me and put his backpack on the ground against the chair leg. He kept pointing at the airplanes and muttering numbers under his breath, either about the model they were or something I couldn't understand. His voice was slurred and difficult to comprehend. I smiled politely and pretended to be interested, then resumed scrolling through my phone. He then told me I was beautiful and asked if I had a boyfriend. I said yes, and he asked if we lived together. I said no and told him I was on my way to see him. The guy asked where my boyfriend was, and I told him he's in Montana for school. Never once did I tell this guy where I'm from. He asked if we were doing long distance, and I said yes. Knowing it's only temporary until my boyfriend graduates in May, the guy then proceeded to tell me I'm wasting my time and money doing long distance, and even went as far as to say that we would break up. This made me angry because this guy knew nothing about our situation and had no business telling me anything about my relationship. I looked him in the eye and told him to leave. He asked why, and I told him I didn't want him there. He kept trying to say things about my relationship, and I kept firmly asking him to leave, getting to the point where I was panicking and yelling. People walking by were starting to look over at us, which made me even more nervous because I don't like to draw a lot of attention to myself in public. The guy finally picked up his bag and told me he would leave, adding that he didn't know why I was mad. He reached out his two fingers for me to shake them goodbye, and I screamed, "Don't touch me." He told me I was being stupid as he stood up, and the last thing he said before walking away was, "Good luck on the breakup." I told him to shut up, and he said something I don't remember as he walked away. I immediately called my boyfriend crying and told him what happened. And then I called my mom. My mom said I should have gotten up and walked away. And if he had followed me, I could have gotten security. In the moment, it's hard to remember your options. Later on, as I walked to my gate, I saw him talking to another girl sitting by herself, introducing himself in the same odd way. I have no idea why he was doing this in an airport. I don't want to assume any mental problems this guy might have had, or if he was under the influence of something, but this terrified me. This went on over the course of a year, with the last incident taking place in December of 2016. I used to own this green 1998 Toyota Camry. It was my grandmother's until she gifted it to my parents, who eventually gave it to me as my first car. It was nice and reliable, but I have a bad habit of letting my cars accumulate a bunch of stuff before cleaning them out. Because I still live with my parents, they would use the car from time to time if they needed it. One day, I noticed a bunch of fishing lines with hooks on them in the back of my car. On one of the rare occasions that I cleaned it out, a bunch of the hooks were embedded into the upholstery and more were wedged between the creases in the seat. It took me a while to get them all out, and I almost pricked myself several times doing it. I had no idea how long they had been there, as the last time I cleaned this much of my car was months ago at any rate. I was annoyed at first. I thought my dad had put them there as he had recently used my car to transport a bunch of old junk for a garage sale. I asked him about it, but he told me he'd never seen any fishing hooks or lines in any of our old stuff. Nobody in my family even fishes, so it wouldn't make any sense for us to have them. He was also the only other person who had used my car in the past year or two. I'm the kind of person who locks up everything. Every night, I triple-check my car doors, and if I'm even a little uncertain as to whether or not I locked up, I will go back to my car and check no matter the inconvenience. I also park it where I can, see it from my bedroom window, and hear if anyone tampers with it, so I doubted anyone could have broken in and assumed my dad had simply missed it. I didn't think anything more of it until a month later when I found even more fishing hooks in my back seat. At this point, I asked my dad about it again, but he figured I was either pulling a weird prank on him or someone was breaking into my car. I wondered, though, why anyone would break into my car, not steal anything out of it, and leave fishing hooks instead. It just didn't make sense to me. To give you an idea of how weird this is, I live in a neighborhood where everyone knows everyone. We all talk and even have a private Facebook group that started because of a drug house at the end of the street cropping up. Though at this point it wasn't active, it served as a sort of neighborhood watch group that always posts whenever something suspicious happens. So I didn't have any neighbors I didn't know for miles, and none of the ones I did know were this shady again. Without any explanation or clear motive, as the days and weeks passed, it faded to the back of my mind. I got a new job selling mattresses as I'd been unemployed, focusing on school for a while, and I moved out of my parents' house to live with my girlfriend. This is where things turned from weird to extremely unsettling. One night we decided to go to a nearby Winco to get something to make food with, and I noticed my back seat had a bunch of fishing lines and hooks in it. Again, startled, I looked around for any sign of someone being nearby. I told her to get back in the house, and I sat up and stared at my car. Until morning came, watching from our bedroom window after triple-checking every door and window to ensure they were all locked. I didn't see anyone or anything. The next morning I got ready for work, and she got ready for her college courses, and we left the store I was working at. During this time, it had a weird L-shaped design to it with two different entrances and a cafe taking up the space between them. There was one entrance that was easily visible from the front desk and another that you would have to get up to see as I was closing up one night after the last incident. I went to turn off the open signs and saw in the center of the obscured hallway an entire roll of fishing line coiled up, but with some of the line leading to the door where a pile of hooks sat. I hadn't had any customers that day and never heard the door alarm go off. I then noticed someone had turned the door alarms off, but neither I nor my only coworker had ever tampered with the device before. Then it was behind the front desk. I was shaking. Someone had been stalking me and leaving these lines, but I had no idea what to do. Call the police? Other than the fishing lines and hooks, there was really nothing to trace back to anyone. My store had no cameras, and corporate would never agree to installing them. Neither my family nor my girlfriend could afford security cameras either. I figured the best I could do was not to appear as frightened as I was in case whoever was doing this was watching me. I thought that if seeing something like this didn't make me go about my day any differently, and I didn't give whatever reaction this person was looking for, they would give up and go away for several more months. I found fishing lines and hooks in my car despite it being locked. My parents, being the only people with extra keys, were much too busy with the construction of their new house and their jobs to take time out of their day to prank me once or twice. I left notes in my car asking whoever it was why they were doing this and to stop. I would find the notes gone whenever the lines and hooks appeared, but with no response. Eventually, after a series of misunderstandings and disagreements with her family, I decided to move out of my girlfriend's house and move in with a couple of friends into their apartment until my parents' new house could be completed. The very last time I had an encounter with the lines and hooks, I came home from work to find them strewn about the living room. Stuff was knocked over and a few things were broken, but nothing was taken. My friend, his girlfriend, and their baby were all gone at the time, so no one was home when this happened save for his cats, which were absolutely spooked and wouldn't come out from under his bed for hours. I still don't know what this person wanted, why they were stalking me in the first place, or what the fishing lines and hooks meant. No one I know is huge into fishing, and I specifically go out of my way not to make enemies or cross people, even purposefully giving people more than I take from them, so that I don't seem like I'm out for myself. I really don't know if it was someone I know or a stranger. Really good at covering their tracks and freaking people out. All I know is that I will have anxiety over this for the rest of my life. I routinely stay up until 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning because, in addition to several other traumatizing experiences, this has made every bump in the night a potential threat to me. It's been almost 9 months since I've seen anything more from this person, but instead of feeling better, I feel more uneasy that someone followed me through that many changes in my life and didn't do anything further than breaking into my work in my friend's house, but that at any time they could, because no safety measures seemed able to deter them. I'm shaking as I'm typing this out. I haven't really talked in great detail with anyone about it, because just describing it makes me feel like a loon. Not only that, but I don't want to worry my friends and family when there's nothing they can do about it or vindicate them if it's one of them that pulled a prank on me. This will likely be a mystery I never see solved.